hold it up.
All right. There we go. And well, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And thanks for tuning into our virtual event with Ian Hamilton. He's going to be talking about the brand new book, The Fury of Beijing, and I'm sure other things as well. And as always, I'll go ahead and put a buy link in the comments field should you wish to purchase a copy. And if you have questions for Ian, go ahead and put those in as well. And Barbara will bring me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, Ian. It's wonderful to see you.
Hey, Barbara. Nice to be with you again.
Thank you. Last time Ian and I were together, we had dinner. No, we had drinks. We had drinks in Toronto when we were cruising the Great Lakes, not Ian, but my husband and I. And I'm delighted that my favorite financial ninja, Ava Lee, is back and taking on the Chinese government over a book that really began the book before, didn't it? Or maybe even two books before, with her venture really into making a movie and reconnecting some people in the film industry.
The story arc actually belonged probably 4 or 5 books before.
Okay.
The Goddess of Yantai was when Ava and Pang Fei, her lover, basically started their relationship, or their relationship was underway. And Ava was in Beijing trying to help Pang Fei with an issue and ran into her ex-husband Lao Lao, which led to Ava trying to rehabilitate him and a script and the film being made and everything else from there. So the story arc probably goes back 4 or 5 books.
I see that. Now that I look back, I've read all of them, but you know, it's a function of old age. I can't always remember all
Me
the time.
neither. Me neither, Barbara.
So if these are in chronological order, did the Mountain Master of Sha Tin come next?
See, now you're testing my memory.
I'm just going by what's in the book, and then praise for the Diamond Queen of Singapore, and then praise for the Sultan of Sarawak. But I'm not, let me just look.
The Mountain Master came after the goddess, as did the Diamond Queen and the Sultan. Yep.
Okay, that's what I thought. Right. So Ava Lee, for those of you who don't know her, is Chinese. She lives in Toronto because her mother's the second wife of her, what is he, Hong Kong based? Isn't Ava Lee's father in Hong Kong?
Yes.
Right. And he's actually taken 3 wives, but nobody really mentions the Australian wife with 2 children who are working out there in case they ever need to come into play. But and Ava Lee has an older sister called Marion, and her mother is called Jenny, I believe it is.
Yes, it is.
And so they have settled, they probably touched down in Vancouver, but anyway, they live in Toronto. And Ava Lee's father comes to visit, talks on the phone, supports them financially, and you know, that's sort of the Chinese way. Ava herself is a lesbian and is in partnership with at least 2 other women that we have met along the whole arc of this series. But I think that the most important person in her life for forever, practically, was called Uncle. So why don't you tell us about Uncle?
Well, he was, when she met him, he was retired from his previous position, which was head of a triad organization. And I wrote a series of 4 novels about Uncle pre-Ava. Okay. And he was born in China, escaped during the Great Famine, swam to Hong Kong, and made his way in life as the best way he could, and that was with the triads. But he retired when she met him, and he was running sort of a debt collection business. And when they first met, she had just graduated from Babson College in Massachusetts with a forensic accounting degree, and was set up in Toronto and trying to run a little business, and it wasn't going very well. But one of her clients, all of her clients were Chinese, and most of them came to her through her mother's contacts. And this guy was owed a lot of money from a chicken feet deal that had gone bad. And Ava went to Hong Kong to try to track down and get the money back. And it turned out Uncle's people were chasing the same guy. And during the course of them trying to track this guy down, Ava was far more successful than Uncle's guys were. And Uncle almost begged her to join him and work with him.
Right.
And that's how their relationship began. And she would have been in her mid-20s, and he was already into his 60s. So it was a grandfather, granddaughter type of relationship. But it was one of intense respect in either direction. And she would never, ever have questioned him. And he would never, ever have done anything to cause her any discomfort. So it was a wonderful relationship, and one of total trust, which is as I always wrote about it, it always actually made me happy to see people trusting each other to that degree.
So Ava's mother liked to do things that she thought would enrich her children's life, expose them to things. So at one point she gave Ava Lee, I think it was the choice between ballet and martial arts, or piano lessons, I can't remember which, and martial arts. So Ava Lee is very good at Bak Mei, which is a Chinese martial art thing. She's very bright. She's a trained forensic accountant, very decisive. And basically she went into the debt collection business with Uncle. And that took her all over the world and into all kinds of industries. I love reading these books because I learned so much about places I will never go and about getting inside industries. I mean, we're in the food industry, we're in the fashion industry, we're in all these other wonderful things. But along the way, she acquired large sums of money, or at least she learned how to play with all kinds of large sums of money, and eventually acquired two partners, and they formed their own corporation, and they called it, was it Three Sisters?
The Three Sisters, the Three Sisters.
And basically they're venture capitalists. They have all this money, and they like to seed various startups or take whatever. And one of the things, which brings us to what we were talking about, the movie industry, is one of the things they decided to do when Ava Lee wanted to help Lau Lau recover from being an addict. I mean, he was in terrible shape, but hugely talented. And she wanted to bring him back. And, so they eventually got involved against the wishes of the Chinese government in making a movie about the Tiananmen Square situation. And
Massacre.
That's where this book opens, because we left them in Cannes at the film festival where their movie has won the Palme d'Or. And we open in this book where the movie and the stars and the director and all have been nominated for Academy Awards, and take it from there. Ian, what happens?
Yeah, so Tiananmen Square is the most sensitive and probably restricted subject in China. I mean, there's nothing on the public record to show it ever occurred.
Really?
The Chinese government goes to enormous lengths to pretend it never happened, and you're not allowed to have any memorial to it. You're not allowed to mention it. They've arrested people in Hong Kong for holding memorial services on the date of Tiananmen Square massacre. So it's I can't overemphasize how sensitive it is and how overreactive the Chinese government gets when it's mentioned. So making the film, they always knew it was dangerous. So Ava and her partners in the Three Sisters own business. Her one partner lives in Hong Kong, the other lives in Wuhan. So Ava's very keen to protect them and protect their businesses from the Chinese government going after them. And so she arranges to finance this film through a Hong Kong law firm, then through a bank in the UK. So, I mean, they're buried. But Lao Lao and Chan Chi, who's the producer, are known. So at the end of the previous book, the two of them are murdered in front of a hotel in Taipei. And in this book, Ava has to decide whether she lets the murders sit or whether she tries to avenge the deaths. And she decides she has to avenge the deaths. As dangerous as that's going to be, and as fearful everyone is for her, she sets out to do that.
She does. So it's basically a story of revenge, but the difficulty for Ava Lee is that how to identify who gave the order to what are clearly paid assassins or paid agents that,
So it's a story of revenge, but I think it's also a story about the politically what's going on in China.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I write about, how things operate there, which is basically there's no rule of law. Xi, who's the premier these days, basically decides who lives and who dies. There are virtually hundreds of senior officials who have disappeared over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
When you step out of line, you're gone, never to be seen again. So Ava knows at the beginning of the book, if she does this, she's stepping into very dangerous territory. In fact, an uncle comes to see her, as he does now, in dreams to talk to her, and emphasizes like two things. One, no loose ends. No one can know what you're trying to do. Okay. And secondly, if you set out to do it, you have to do it all the way. And she decides that's what she's going to do. So with assistance from some old cohorts, she goes to Taipei to hunt down the people who actually were involved there in the murders. And then that leads her to the guy who's the head of the Chinese film syndicate. And eventually to the guy who's like one of the most senior people in the entire Secret Service system in China. And she goes after all of them. And it was actually a fun book to write, I have to say. Okay. Because I've been watching what's been going on in Hong Kong and China, and it depresses the hell out of me, because I love Hong Kong. I used to spend so much time there, and it was such a vibrant, lively, active city, and it's like completely changed. Chinese have put their thumb down, and no one can say anything or do anything. There's no sense of democracy or free speech. It's all gone. So sorry to ramble.
No, you didn't ramble at all. Yeah, I think, it's a nearly impossible task. It's not so hard in Taipei because, they figure out that the Chinese Secret Service has got a front there, and they're able to identify enough people and, take care of that. And it's hard for Ava Lee because I think up until then, hasn't she just killed one person herself? She's not generally.
She'd killed more, but she'd killed some in absolute self-defense in the middle of a like a gunfight or something like that. But she'd only ever killed one person in cold blood.
Right.
And it haunted her. And she wasn't sure she could ever do it again. But the murder of Lao Lao and she was, and her friend Chi was so outrageous, so terrible, because she felt responsible for the film being made. She thought it was on her, that the film would never have been made unless she hadn't sent him to rehab. It would never have been made unless she hadn't actually loved the script he wrote and decided to finance it. and then she talked her friend into producing it. So she felt obliged, obligated to get revenge.
Well, Ava Lee is a consummate deal maker, and in the course of the book, she ends up making various deals, and they're international. I mean, she has people she calls on in Canada. She has somebody in this book she calls on in Los Angeles. Uncle left her two or three people that she can call on, and they're all very loyal to each other. And then, the triads, Ian knows a lot about the triads. This book is actually called Ava Lee, the Triad Years, but they have special names like Mountain Master and Red Pole and whatever it is. So, I feel as though I've learned triad speak in reading these books, which I probably wouldn't have come across. So, she doesn't, I mean, she operates alone, but she always has cohorts, or people she can direct. But Ava Lee is a very forward thinker. She's always, moving ahead with whatever it is she's doing, whether it was recovering money in, earlier books or forming a venture capital fund and deciding how to use that money. Even here, as Ian points out, it's her that really gets this movie together. Without her, it would never have been made. And now the consequences are that two people are dead, and Ava Lee is now the lover of the film star. So there's, she needs to protect her as well. And I was going to ask you, and you don't really bring this up in the book, but we know that North Korea and Russia managed to, strike all around the world. But is China, I mean, how safe are they in Toronto from Chinese?
Well, so I think it was 6 months ago, we had a political scandal here about the Chinese government trying to influence political officials. Okay. In Asia, the Chinese reach into every country you can imagine. And, their attitude is that if you were born in China, you're Chinese. It doesn't matter if you immigrated and got a US passport. They think that's like flying a flag of convenience for a merchant ship. You're still Chinese. So they don't accept the fact you have an American passport as being valid. So if you're an American businessman and you got into a dispute with the Chinese company, and particularly if that company has some government contacts, and you were, say, doing business in Hong Kong, staying at the Four Seasons Hotel, it isn't unbelievable to think you might wake up and find a guy with a gun to your head in your room and taking you out of the hotel and loading you into a car and driving you over the border into China, where you would be tried. So the Chinese government reaches to Hong Kong, they go into Macau, they go into Thailand, they go into all those countries, and take people out of there and take them back to China. And it happens all the time. It hasn't happened in North America yet, but it's not inconceivable either. So yeah, the Chinese government is a long reach, a very long reach. And Ava is very conscious of that,
Well, you had an incident in Canada where purportedly India, some agents of, I'm trying to remember whether it was the Sikh or whatever it was, anyway, tried to assassinate somebody or at least make a move on somebody in Canada and precipitate the real scandal. And that seems to be, increasingly that agents are coming into other countries, agents of one government. I'm sure we don't have our hands clean by a long shot. We do the same thing. So, part of what I wondered in the book, although, this is more about revenge, but how much of it was Ava Lee really wanting to protect Bang Fai?
It was a lot, but she was desperate to protect her lover. So in the context of the book, she strikes a deal which should give her lover some protection. Ava's protection comes from the fact that no one in China really knows what she did. She goes to extraordinary lengths to keep invisible. So she's a passport with a new name. She does everything she can to stay in the background and not known. Okay, and that's a large part of the plot actually, is her keeping it low, you know.
Well, at the end of this, since China is becoming, less easily visited, less easily penetrated and all, I can imagine that Ava Lee might, be moving whatever she's doing in a different direction, maybe more towards Europe again, or something, but it doesn't appear to me to be terribly safe for her to, go back to China.
No, by the end of the book, I think it's obvious that her going back to China isn't going to happen. Not short term anyway.
Right.
In fact, and probably all of Asia is off limits at that point in time.
Well,
And
that can certainly change. I mean, but I think it gives you a chance to take her in a new direction if you feel like it,
it does indeed, yeah.
Yeah, which and I've really enjoyed. I mean, she's been to Italy in the fashion industry, she's been to the Faroe Islands in the food industry. There certainly are other places she could go and other things. I sort of miss her when she was chasing the money. I really loved her when she was basically, a debt
Yeah.
collector.
Well, who knows, Barbara, that she may return to that. I mean, it was I loved writing about those businesses because
Yeah.
I was, well, partially because I was involved in some of them and I knew them intimately, but the others I was just interested in, like the fashion industry. I knew nothing about it, but I met some people who did, and I found it really interesting and fascinating. And just having someone tell me, like you watch the shows from Milan and London every year, the fashion weeks, and to have someone explain how a runway show actually happens
Mhm.
was fascinating because I had no idea. And it's like it was military precision and quick. It was fascinating anyway. And the
Oh, it was-
places are, and as you know, I've been to nearly every place I write about. And but the one thing I try to do is not write travelogues. I mean, I try to give the sense of a flavor of a place from my perspective. So it's things that I find interesting or quirky about places.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, I have never been to Sarawak, never been to Borneo, I'm not likely to go, but now I know a lot more about them than I did before I read Ian's books. The Philippines.
Faroe Islands,
Not one
Faroe
of them.
Islands.
Yeah, well, I've been to the Faroe Islands several times, so that part was okay. But I really enjoyed your book set in the Philippines. I thought that was fascinating, and it was a great plot too. And the plots do, I mean, the landscape of the book and the plot, the story, the movement of it really are inextricably entwined in your books. And so. I've never been sure. Do you think about where you'd like to, go and write about and then devise a story, or do you think up a story and then figure out where to put it?
Well, I the only book that happened with where I had a plot and didn't know where to put it was the Imam of Tawi Tawi, which is the one set in the Philippines.
Okay.
And that book went through 4 separate lives before it ended up being the Imam of Tawi Tawi. So I had this plot, I had the plot idea, but it wasn't an Ava. It didn't start off as an Ava novel. It started off as a standalone spy novel, which I thought didn't work. So then I rewrote it, still didn't work. And then I turned it into an Ava, and my editor hated it. But we ended up having a conversation and agreeing on some changes. And by the time I finished it, she said, I think it's the best book we've ever done. Which was interesting. The other books, though, most of the plots came to me as I was writing a previous book. So
Ah,
I always had like a story arc in my head. So when I was writing the first book, the plot for the second came to me as I was writing it. As I was writing the second book, plots for 3 and 4 came to me. As I was writing the third, all of a sudden I knew how the sixth book was going to end.
hmm.
So I always had a story arc. It was always like 2 or 3 books ahead. But they always came from what I was writing. So when I talked about the Fury, the genesis of that is the Goddess of Yantai, which is like 4 or 5 books ago. Okay, and I knew where I was going with it. So it's the pleasure for me is taking the trip. Just going along with it.
So Uncle, who was elderly when Ava Lee and he got together, eventually developed cancer and died.
Yeah.
So we lost him. But what you then did, which I thought was really interesting, is that you then wrote 4 books about Uncle and his life before Ava Lee, called The Lost Decades of Uncle Chao Tung. And I really enjoyed those books because I think his story is remarkable. His swimming to Hong Kong from China and losing his wife, which was heartbreaking for him, and clawing his way as an immigrant basically
Yeah.
into some kind of role in Hong Kong. But now there's a gap that has been left between those books and when he met Ava Lee. Isn't there like a 10-year gap here that could be filled?
Yeah, there's a 10-year gap between when Uncle first meets Ava
Right.
and the first actual Ava Lee novel. Because in my mind, I always had the first Ava Lee novel. Ava's in her like early to mid 30s.
Okay.
Okay. And when she met Uncle for the first time, she was like 25.
Okay.
So they became partners when she was 25. The first Ava novel is set, she's like 35. So there is a 10-year gap. And I've often thought about going back and filling in the 10 years with more stories about Ava and Uncle.
I think that would be wonderful. And also because China was not as it is at the moment, you could go back to Asia where it's much harder to do it right now.
I could. And the other thing that would be easier, Barbara, truthfully, is technology wasn't as well developed then.
Yes.
So I wouldn't have to worry about texting or whatever. I mean, they could actually use a telephone again or whatever.
Right. Well, Ava Lee really lives on her phone. I mean, I love the way she's constantly, booking reservations and booking hotels, and everything is first class with Ava Lee because she has lots of money. So, she's hanging out in the Mandarin Orientals and she's flying first class and,
Well, like the debt collection business in Asia is you keep 30% of what you collect. So when they were going after some large debts.
mhm.
So yeah, she made a lot of money and lives well.
She does. And then she and her 2 partners and the 3 sisters, they have done very well also.
They have.
So I mean,
Three good businesswomen.
right. But to finance a movie, that's an extremely expensive thing to do. And one of the dilemmas that Ava Lee has is that, they've hidden from China who they are through a, cutout company and so forth. But there's the risk of exposure, but there's also a risk if they decide to walk away from it all of losing an extraordinary amount of money.
Yeah.
So there's some really interesting moral questions in this book, but Ava's always managed to stay aligned with the people she works with. She's really, in the end, not at cross purposes with her partners, with Uncle,
No.
whatever. Probably her biggest conflict is with her mother, but they seem to have mellowed slightly too.
Do you know I've had Toronto is full of second wives, okay, and second families. The Toronto private school system would collapse if they weren't here, because the second wives go. The thing they can extract from the husbands is the full support for their children, the best schools, the best this, the best that, and Ava's mother is, I mean, excellent at doing that, or was excellent at doing that, and so then the children, you hear about the tiger mothers. Well, the fact that Ava went to back martial arts isn't actually that unusual, but she would also have have to learn a musical instrument, okay, taken Mandarin lessons. I mean, she would have been busy 4 or 5 nights a week on the stuff her mother was organizing. And I love the relationship that Ava and her mother have. Her mother is flawed, and Ava sees every flaw and never says a word about any of it. The Chinese in general, not specifically, but in general, tend to be anti-gay. But her mother knows that Ava's gay, and their relationship is such that they never have to talk about it. Her mother never mentions it. Ava never has to talk about it. They both understand that they know without saying anything, and that's how they exist. And they love each other to death, and that's the relationship. And so in a sense, Ava tolerates her mother, okay, while she loves her. But she knows her mother would lie down in front of a bus for her if push came to shove, and that's really all that matters at the end of the day. So.
Well, what about her relationship with her father, Marcus, who is still living with his first wife and his first set of children in Hong Kong?
That's more strained.
Mm.
She can accept, well, she's been raised with knowing no other kind of relationship. So for her, this is normal. Like being part of a second family is normal. And it comes attached with rules and regulations, okay, not written, but understood. And she knows all of that, And so it is not uncommon for men who have money in Hong Kong to have multiple wives and multiple families. And it's not uncommon for the families to all know each other and to actually interact, okay? So there's I don't know, perhaps it's the same way with the Mormons in Utah, okay?
I don't know that much about it. I mean, there are certainly, other cultures where there are multiple wives,
But in the Chinese culture, it's a very old tradition.
Judge Dee, I still remember, because that's actually most of what I knew about China for years. And there were indeed white and official concubines, not just
Yes.
wives.
Yeah.
So you could have quite a household of women.
Barbara, and in Hong Kong, it was legal until 1959. I mean, it was actually in the law that was permitted to happen, and there were rules and regulations governing it, okay? And I know that because I was doing an event in Toronto, and a woman stood up and said to me that she loved my books, but she thought the whole thing of the second wives was ridiculous. And a Chinese woman stood up and said, no, it's not ridiculous. I'm a second wife. And as Ian describes it, it's completely accurate. So anyway, that was a strange moment, I have to say.
I'm sure it was. Well, in one book, Ava Lee actually goes back to Hong Kong and gets involved with her family there. And one of her partners, Amanda, I think it is married to her brother.
Her half brother, yeah.
Michael, first wife's son. And so, yeah, they do. It's strained, but they do interact with each other.
So that was I have some scenes or set pieces throughout the books that I particularly love, and I loved writing them, and I was so happy writing them. And one is at Amanda's wedding,
Right.
which is the Two Sisters of Borneo. That's the book, and the opening scene is this wedding, and her father's first wife is there. Elizabeth is her name. And Ava's there, and she's actually the maid of honor for Amanda. And it's a really, everyone's uncomfortable. Elizabeth's sisters were there, and they hate Ava. They hate her being there. They can't understand why Amanda would let this happen. And Elizabeth knows that in the previously, Ava had saved the family's business. And Elizabeth actually gets up and addresses the entire wedding party to say, I accept Ava, I respect her, blah, 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 blah. And I loved writing that. It was a very powerful scene for me.
Well, there are many wonderful scenes in the books, and I have truly enjoyed them. There are, I found a spread in the back with covers. So we start with the water rat of Wan Chai, right?
Yep.
So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, so there are 15. This is the
16th.
16th. And then there are 4 books with Uncle. So if you've never read one, you don't have to start with the first one, but it is kind of better if you track Ava Lee. I mean, every story's complete, so it isn't as though the mysteries carry over or there are any cliffhangers or whatever. But I do think that the development of the relationships and all the rest of it is better if you start at the beginning. But I like the way that Uncle has his 4 stories. So now I think there's a real possibility that there could be a set of Ava Lees before the Water Rat of Wan Chai and after Uncle.
Retro Ava. Retro Ava and Uncle. Yeah.
Right. And you're right. It does solve, it makes it easier not to have to deal with super technology. It makes it easier not to have to guess what's going on in the political world. There's some thriller writers here who are tracking. Brad Taylor just wrote a book that is so on the edge of the war in the Ukraine and whatever, that at any moment his book, before it published, could have become, contradicted by world events.
Yeah.
But, and that's a risk if you're writing about China right now.
Yes.
But if you're writing an older China, then you aren't gonna face that. One of the things you mentioned is that there's really no distinction now between the Communist Party and the communist government. I guess there used to be some kind of, at least
pretense, perhaps.
Yeah, pretense, but now it's not the same. And basically, she has set himself up as a dictator for life in the same way that, anybody who believes that the upcoming Russian election is going to actually be an election, it's ridiculous, which is something I hope we get to avoid here in this country.
No, she wants to, actually has been trying to get the title chairman. And after Mao, the party basically said, we will never have another chairman, because Mao had gone nutty at the end. But he wants to be chairman. So,
and he's getting older, and no telling, how nutty he may get. And
exactly,
I remember Stalin. We've seen that people who are dictators with absolute power generally don't end well, and generally do kind of go off the rails with no one to check them.
Yes. Which is terrifying in a great many countries, and the possibility of is terrifying.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. So anyway, why don't we see if Patrick has questions from the audience, because we have really said all we can say, but except that it was interesting to spend more time with Beijing, because it's always just been kind of a place that Ava Lee has gone past or through, but she's never actually spent time there. I have been to Beijing, but it was long ago in 1997, which is my only trip inside China. And so it was fun to, to read about it and recognize some things.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we do have some good questions that have come in.
Great.
One of them is, could you please elaborate on why you chose a female protagonist in the midst of a triad from a culture where females are traditionally not as valued as males, much less in triads?
That's really a good question. So just excuse me one second. People have this misconception about women in Asia. Okay. They think that they're somehow they kowtow. Okay. And when I first started to do business there in 89, okay, you'd go to these large companies, and they always had a vice president who was in charge of entertaining the foreign visitors, and then all the staff were there. But you'd be there for 2 or 3 days, and always in the background, usually there were these young women, and they were taking notes, and they were being just attentive. And then it came the last day of your trip, and you're sitting down to actually conduct a business deal. And you start to negotiate. And invariably, the president or the chairman of the company would turn to the young women and say, what do you think? Because in reality, these young women were like almost running the company. Okay. But because they're self-effacing and overly polite, people misinterpret that as a weakness or as not having status, and that's not true. They had enormous power. A woman ran Hong Kong during the last 10 years when the Brits were there. It wasn't the Brits who were running Hong Kong; it was a woman. And I read an article about her in the South China Morning Post. It was sort of a day in the life of this woman, but how she would get up in the morning, put her husband's toothpaste in his toothbrush, lay out his clothes, prepare his breakfast, sort of get his lunch ready, and then she would go off to run Hong Kong. And I loved the juxtaposition of that you could be the two things. So Ava is more North American now, in my mind, or was more. She had a North American sense of herself as a woman, okay, but a Chinese sense of how to relate to people in terms of the respect, okay, and so that was the balancing act. The reason I made her a woman was because I had no choice. I never thought about it. When I sat down to write the first book, I was just out of hospital, like 2 days out of hospital. I was highly medicated, and I decided I wanted to write a book. And I've never plotted or planned a book. I just sit down and start to write. And I sat down, I started to write, and I found myself writing about Ava Lee. The name came from nowhere, and she was there. And I was sort of subconsciously, streaming my years of working in Asia, the businesses I've been involved in, experiences I had, but also my respect for women combined with my love of Chinese culture and history. So it was a real mishmash. So I never really thought about writing. It wasn't deliberate. I didn't deliberately decide to write about a woman. It was spontaneous. It was just there. And that's what happened. So
You've mentioned, you've addressed this a little bit already, but there's a question from Jan. She'd like to know, are you able to discuss why this book will be the last?
as
Probably
Barbara
not.
and I were saying earlier,
No,
it may
let's
not
not.
be the last.
Yeah, let's not do that because there's stuff going on in the world that makes it difficult sometimes for writers to write about who they aren't. But I think that Ava Lee and her 10-year gap, there are ways to publish
Fill
more
it.
of the stories.
Yeah.
And Ian and I'll talk those over because I'm not prepared to give up on Ava Lee, who's brought me enormous pleasure and taught me a lot. over the period of time that Ian and I have worked together. Ian was a writer in residence for us at the Poison Pen some years ago. So, we really have spent quite a lot of time with Ava Lee and with Ian.
Yeah, we have. One thing for people who have not read the books, one thing I'd like to say is I work very hard at not being repetitive. I don't recycle plots and I don't recycle I've tried to keep the stories and my characters as fresh as possible and changing constantly. So sub characters come and go all the time, and because I don't want to be bored when I'm writing this stuff. I mean, I want to be energized and enjoying it. And sort of writing the same stuff over and over again would bore me to tears. So I've worked very hard at keeping the books fresh.
Okay, let's see here. Here's a question. Do you train in martial arts, or did you? If so, which forms?
I did not train, and I would be absolutely hopeless at any form of martial arts. When I decided that she would have a martial art, I did some research and I found Back By, and that's what I've used. And I've actually had emails from Back By instructors thanking me for writing about it and saying that my descriptions are fully accurate. So that which pleased me no end, because I do strive to be accurate.
Oh, Ava Lee is a small woman, and she's in a lot of very dangerous places, and it's great that she has a way of defending herself and occasionally striking out.
Well, and Back My, truthfully, is the most lethal form of martial arts. I mean, it's strictly designed to inflict damage. It's not a defensive martial art. And I get, again, I get emails from readers, and they're mainly female. When she doesn't get into a scrap in a book, people are invariably disappointed because they want to see her take down some 250-pound guy who's been harassing her.
Well, that's about it for really the questions. I mean, you addressed some of these. Are you working on a new series or a standalone? Is there anything?
I've written the first novel in what could be a new series, and I'm working on the second one. But Barbara's got my interest peaked to fill in some gaps there.
It's a purely selfish thing. I'm not prepared to give up a character that I really love. So we'll figure something out. There are various roads to publishing today. And many of them deserve to be explored. I see every day something new popping up. And to give you an idea, when I got an email from Edelweiss, which is a place where publishers put all their stuff, there were 1,700 plus books released last week alone.
Oh
So
my God.
I know. And nearly 300 books just of adult fiction. So there's just an absolute ton of books being released from multiple sources. And I think that's a healthy thing, although I have to tell you, I just can't keep up with it all. I mean, I don't know about you, Patrick, but I feel as though, I'm lucky to even cope with, 5% anymore of
and you're a speed reader, Barbara.
well, yeah, but I mean, there's only so much that, you can read and promote to your customers. And the buzzword, for a good bookstore is you have a curated collection. It isn't just, stuff. Publishers don't just send you their bestsellers. In theory, your whole staff contributes to it, which is certainly true in our case. We have various staff members who are interested in different things and who order books. But, you can't embrace, even a giant Barnes and Noble can't really embrace the totality of what's out there. But I think it's very good news for authors that, your channels have multiplied, and there are so many ways to reach readers now, not necessarily through bookstores, although I'd like to think that our readers actually reach us. I mean, reach books through us, but I see things that people order that wouldn't occur to us to actually have carried in the store. Do you see that, Patrick? You know, it's really
Yeah.
interesting, you know, the range of books that we sell, and that's all customer driven. So, you know, it's very hard to determine anymore exactly how things go in the store, but we do have staff, what we call staff pick shelves, and we do recommend a range of paperbacks every month, and we do highlight event books and so forth. So, you know, the average reader can probably do very well on what we do cover, and they have the freedom to go to other sources like bookshop.org, which is a very, very useful amalgamation of independent bookstores. And it's a revenue sharing thing. So if one of the Poison Pen customers wants something that we don't have, they can go to Bookshop and order it. And we get like, I don't know, 10% of it or something. But eventually there's a pool of money that comes to you at some, you know, specified interval. And that's really helped bookstores all around to, you know, to do well, but it's very good for customers too. It's an easy place to go. Anyway, Ian, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. More
And
will
you,
be
Barbara.
revealed after we figure out what comes next. But I hope that if you've never read Ava Lee, that you will go back and do that. And if you have, this is the most recent book, The Fury of Beijing. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, everybody. Appreciate your taking the time to watch it with us. Ian, always a pleasure, my dear.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Patrick, thank you.